Chapter 22, Immunity, Part 1, Screencast 1. Chapter 22 will be divided into two parts, and this first part will be focusing primarily on what we refer to as innate or nonspecific immunity. The first thing that we will talk about are infectious agents, and those are going to be those agents that can actually damage or kill a host. We may hear them described as pathogens. And pathogenic agents are those agents that actually can create harm, and they fall under 5 major categories. And those categories are bacteria, viruses, fungi, protozoans, and multicellular parasites. If we look at this particular table here, table 22.1, it actually describes the major categories of infectious agents. The first that we're going to talk about are going to be bacteria. They are intracellular and extracellular microbes. Keep in mind that these are considered to be living. Now, one of the things that I want to point out here is that the majority of bacteria are non-pathogenic. Most of them are good, and very few are actually pathogenic and result in disease. But if we look at some examples, we've talked about some of them already. There are a number of diseases that we refer to as bacterial in nature. Lyme disease, salmonella, tuberculosis, syphilis, just to name a few. The next category are viruses. And one thing to keep in mind here, viruses are not considered to be alive. They are not cells, and basically they are DNA or RNA within a capsid protein. The important thing to remember here is that viruses require a host so that they can actually replicate the virus itself. If we look at examples of viral infections, COVID, which we've gone through, but also the common cold, the flu, hepatitis, and also HIV. Those are all viral infections. The third category is going to be fungi. And one of the issues with fungi is they actually produce spores that release proteolytic enzymes. If we look at some things that are actually due to these spores, diaper rash, athlete's foot, yeast infections, those are all examples of fungal infections. Then we have protozoans. These are actually intracellular and extracellular parasites that interfere with normal cellular functions. Examples here would be malaria and a number of other types of diseases that are out there. Then we have multicellular parasites. These actually live within a host. They grow in size with nutrients that are provided by the host. And if we look at parasitic infections, they would include infections such as tapeworms, lung flutes, liver flutes, pinworms, etc. A type that does not follow under those 5 categories are called prions. And prions are fragments of infectious proteins. They are not cells, nor are they viruses. And they actually cause disease within the nervous tissue. If we look at variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, more familiarly known as mad cow disease, this is a prion disease. And this was actually a disease that was spread from cows to humans by consuming infected meat. Now, you may have heard of zombie deer, and they are actually found rather regularly now. They have been reported in western New York, and it is suspected that their condition is actually caused by a prion. Now, this particular table is not in the textbook, and it really is just an overview of all of the general immune cells, their locations, and their functions. This is not a table that I'm going to go through completely, but I do recommend that you take a look at it because there is a lot of good information here, and it's a nice one-stop shopping for cells of the immune system, where we can find them, and what their general function is overall. Now here we're basically looking at the general types of immune cells and their general location. We've talked about white blood cells or leukocytes previously. They are found circulating in our blood. We have secondary lymphatic structures, so the lymph node, spleen, tonsils, mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue would be examples of those. We have select organs. Here we have an image of macrophages that are found in the lungs. We have dendritic cells that are associated with the skin and mucosal membranes. And then also we're going to find immune cells in connective tissue scattered throughout the entire body. Now, one real important factor that we need to address are cytokines. And what cytokines are, these are the small proteins that are regulators of immune activity. They are produced by cells of both innate and the adaptive immune system. We describe them as chemical messengers that are released from one cell that bind to receptors of target cells. They can act on cells that released it, that would be an autocrine, on local cells, paracrine, or on distant cells after circulating through the blood, endocrine. One thing to remember here is cytokines have a relatively short half-life, and they play 4 primary functions within our body. They provide ways to communicate between cells. These will be interleukins. They may regulate the development of immune cells. Examples would be interleukins and colony-stimulating factors. They may regulate the inflammatory response. This could be interleukins or tumor necrosis factor, or destroying cells, and those also would be tumor necrosis factor and interferon. So together, these are the primary functions that we actually associate with cytokines. Now, one of the things that we have to remember, there are 2 types of immunity. You may have heard as innate immunity. That is also known as nonspecific. We also have adaptive immunity, and this is quite often identified as specific immunity. Now, what is going to differentiate these 2 types of immunity are the different types of cells that are involved, the specificity of cellular response, the various mechanisms of eliminating harmful substances, the amount of time it takes for these responses to take place. Although innate and adaptive immunities are distinct, they work together in protecting our body from all sorts of different pathogens. Now, when we look at innate immunity, this is present at birth. It is going to protect against a variety of different substances, but nonspecific. There is no prior exposure to a substance necessary to elicit a response. Examples will be barriers of the skin and the mucosal membranes, nonspecific cellular and molecular internal defenses. And the thing to keep in mind here is this branch of immunity will respond immediately to potentially harmful agents. Then we have adaptive immunity. This is also known as acquired or specific immunity. This type of immunity involves response to an antigen and is going to be related to T cells and B cells or lymphocytes. A particular cell will respond to one specific foreign substance, but not another. Now, one thing that's important to remember, this is a type of immunity that takes several days to actually be effective. Now, here we can basically look at a complete overview of the immune system. One branch we've talked about is innate and immune systems. Remember, we've described this as nonspecific. And one thing to keep in mind here, there are multiple components that protect against a wide array of substances. We look at skin and mucosal membranes. So these are barrier that actually prevent entry. Then we have nonspecific internal defenses. These are subdivided into 3 categories. It could be cells, and examples would be macrophages and natural killer cells. We have chemicals such as interferon and complement. And then we have physiological responses within the body, which would be the inflammatory response and fever. When we look at adaptive immune system, this is adaptive immunity, and this is going to be provided by lymphocytes that are activated to replicate and respond when stimulated by a specific antigen. We have T cells. This is referred to as cell-mediated immunity. We have B cells or B lymphocytes. This is humoral immunity. They are going to exert their effect by plasma cells, which will actually synthesize and release antibodies. Now, The second part of this chapter will be focusing on adaptive immunity. The remaining of this chapter, or part of the screencast, will be focusing on nonspecific or innate immunity.